All right, today we're jumping into a really interesting sourcebook. Its entire premise is that the language used in our local and state laws might have hidden operational meanings. The whole thing is built on the idea that the words we see in policy documents aren't just there by chance. They're chosen to achieve very specific goals. So, what's the core idea here? Well, according to this source, common policy terms that we hear all the time, words like sustainability or equity, have a specific operational meaning that isn't always what you'd think. It suggests this language is, intentionally designed to get very particular outcomes. So, to unpack all this, the source starts by building what it calls a lexicon. Think of it like a decoder ring. The whole point is to translate these terms, arguing that there's a big difference between how we use them in everyday conversation and how they're actually applied in law and government. Let's look at a couple of examples right from this lexicon. From the source's point of view, sustainability isn't just about, being green. Its operational meaning is all about controlling resource and land use, mostly through the permitting process. And then you have smart growth over on the right, which it defines as a policy that actively pushes for denser cities while at the same time restricting new development out in rural areas. And these interpretations get even more specific. The source claims the operational meaning of climate resilience is actually to restrict new construction and rezone land. Then there's equity. It defines this not as general fairness, but as a specific tool used to reallocate land and even funding, all based on certain social metrics. The analysis goes even deeper from there. Take a term like public-private partnerships. It sounds super collaborative, right? But it's defined here in a very particular way, as a method to privatize parts of governance, where private groups operate under contracts that are aligned with international goals, specifically those of the UN. So you might be wondering, how does the source book even try to back this up? Well, after laying out all these definitions in its lexicon, it then tries to connect the dots by tracing this very specific language through 2 decades of actual laws, focusing in on the state of Connecticut. And this timeline? This is basically the core evidence the source presents to make its case. It maps out key public acts, starting back in 2004 and going all the way up to a proposed bill for 2025. The claim here is that all of these laws contain that specific type of language from its lexicon, which it then explicitly links to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. And if we look a little closer at that timeline, the source points to these specific acts as proof. It's trying to show you a pattern, right? How legislation kind of evolved from just creating greenhouse gas registries to then establishing environmental justice zones, and then finally to this really comprehensive planning for climate resilience. The argument is that this shows a clear, intentional trend in lawmaking. Okay, so after defining the terms and then tracing their supposed use in state law, the document makes a huge pivot. It lays out what it calls a legal resistance structure, which is, for all intents and purposes, a playbook for regular citizens in towns to challenge how these policies are being applied. So how exactly would this resistance work in the real world? The source breaks it down into a step-by-step process. It all starts with something that sounds pretty simple, but is actually really powerful, just demanding clear legal definitions for these vague policy terms. From there, the playbook suggests you escalate the challenge, first through administrative notices, and then, if you have to, with actual legal action to question the authority behind these policies. And here's where we get into the real nitty-gritty tactics the sourcebook suggests. You can see the strategies range from some pretty formal legal moves, like using a court action called a declaratory judgment to challenge an agency's authority, to more grassroots stuff. For instance, it suggests simply educating local town officials that these big international standards aren't actually mandatory unless they've been explicitly passed into local or state law. Now, to keep all of this from being just, abstract theory, the source provides a couple of tactical case scenarios. These are designed to show how this playbook could actually be used in real-world situations that might involve landowners and local governments. All right, so picture this for the first scenario. You've got a private land trust that holds its land allodially, which basically means with absolute ownership. They get denied a development permit, and the official reason given by the state's environmental agency is resilience noncompliance. So what do? Here's the playbook's recommended response. It suggests a really direct and assertive legal challenge. First, you refuse to accept the agency's jurisdiction. Then, you demand a formal hearing, and force the agency to show you the specific state law that gives them the authority to deny your permit in the first place. In the second scenario, we shift gears a bit. We're not talking about a private landowner anymore, but a whole town government. In this case, the town is denied state funding for a big infrastructure project, and the reason is because its town plan isn't seen as being climate-aligned enough. Now, notice how the whole strategy changes here. This is interesting. Instead of that direct legal fight, the source suggests using legislative and public channels. It advises petitioning the state legislature to review the decision, using Freedom of Information Act requests to try and uncover any communications, and then mounting a public challenge based on the town's due process rights. So when you boil it all down, what this sourcebook really does is present a very specific framework for looking critically at the language of our laws. It argues that words are powerful tools and that understanding their operational meaning is absolutely key. And it kind of leaves us with this final, much bigger question to think about. How much does the specific language of policy truly shape the world we live in?